The candles trembled as the doors of the ballroom flew open, and a woman's cry cut through the music like a blade through silk. Every head turned. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the wall, her gloved hands tightening around her fan, watching as a young lady stumbled backward from the dance floor with tears streaking down her powdered cheeks. Behind her stood the man everyone in London feared to cross, Duke Alistair Voss, his face carved from ice, his eyes empty of any regret. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. A few cold words, spoken low enough that only the girl could hear them, had been enough to break her in front of 300 guests. The orchestra faltered, unsure whether to continue, and the girl fled through the crowd with her mother rushing after her, whispering apologies to no one in particular. Eleanor felt her stomach twist. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Duke of Voss did not court women, he destroyed them, one dance at a time, as though marriage itself were a war he intended to win by leaving no rival standing. Some said he had been jilted years ago and never recovered. Others said he simply enjoyed cruelty the way other men enjoyed brandy. Eleanor had always dismissed the rumors as exaggeration. Now she was not so sure. Someone should tell him what he is, she murmured, not truly meaning for anyone to hear. But the words carried further than she intended, slipping into a lull in the music, landing squarely in the path of the one man she had least wished to notice her. Duke Alistair Voss turned his head slowly, and his gaze found her across the room as though drawn by a string. Eleanor's breath caught. She was nobody of consequence, a gentlewoman with a modest name and a smaller fortune, the kind of woman dukes did not bother to remember after a single season. Yet he was walking toward her now, unhurried, each step deliberate, the crowd parting before him like water before a ship's bow. "You have something to say to me," he said, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her chin upward to meet his eyes. They were gray, sharp, and entirely without warmth. "Say it then. I find silence tedious, and gossip even more so." Eleanor's pulse hammered, but she refused to look away. She had spent her whole life being overlooked, tucked into corners at parties, spoken over by men who found her opinions inconvenient. She would not shrink now simply because this particular man wore a title heavier than his conscience. "I said someone should tell you what you are," she repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. "Since it seems no one has had the courage. You humiliated that girl for sport, Your Grace. There is no honor in it, whatever you tell yourself." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the nearby guests. No one spoke to the Duke of Voss that way. No one dared. Eleanor half expected him to turn on his heel and dismiss her as beneath his notice, the way he dismissed everyone. Instead, the corner of his mouth curved, not quite a smile, more the shadow of one, sharp enough to cut. "Bold words from a woman who does not know my name beyond what fools whisper behind fans," he said. "Tell me, since you seem to have decided who I am, what would you have me do differently?" "Behave as though other people are not simply pieces on a board for you to move and discard," Eleanor said. "Behave as though a woman's feelings matter more than your amusement." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something flickered behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. Around them, the crowd had gone very quiet, straining to catch every word of an exchange that would surely be repeated in every drawing room in London by morning. "You dance, Miss Whitmore," she said. "Eleanor Whitmore. Miss Whitmore." He said her name as though testing its weight. "You dance, I assume, since you are at a ball and not hiding in a library somewhere with your judgments." "I dance when the partner is worth the trouble," she said, immediately regretting the sharpness of it, though she did not take it back. Something like genuine amusement crossed his face this time, brief and startling. "Then, let us discover whether I am worth the trouble, Miss Whitmore. One waltz. You clearly believe you understand my character better than I do myself. Prove it. Dance with me, and if I fail to earn your good opinion, you may say whatever you like about me tomorrow, and I will not contradict you." Eleanor's mother, Margaret Whitmore, appeared at her elbow so quickly it seemed she had been listening from behind a pillar the entire time. Her face was pale with a mixture of horror and desperate hope, the particular expression of a woman who had spent 3 seasons trying to marry off a daughter with more opinions than dowry. "Eleanor would be delighted, Your Grace," Margaret said quickly, before Eleanor could refuse. "Mother," Eleanor hissed under her breath. "It is only a dance," Margaret whispered back, gripping her daughter's arm with more strength than her thin frame suggested she possessed. "You will not embarrass this family by refusing a duke in front of half of London." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to say that dancing with a man who had just made a young woman weep was not a small thing at all, but the Duke was already extending his hand, and every eye in the ballroom had turned toward them, waiting to see what the strange, outspoken Miss Whitmore would do. Across the room, near the refreshment table, Lady Constance Hale watched with narrowed eyes over the rim of her glass. She had spent 2 seasons maneuvering herself into the Duke's orbit, positioning herself at every event he attended, laughing at jokes he never made, waiting for the moment he would finally look at her the way society expected him to look at his future Duchess. She had never once considered that a woman like Eleanor Whitmore, with her plain gowns and her sharp tongue, might become an obstacle worth noticing. "He is only doing it to embarrass her," Constance said to her companion, though the words sounded thinner than she intended. "He will make a fool of her on the floor and everyone will laugh, and that will be the end of it." Her companion said nothing, watching as the Duke led Eleanor onto the floor with a courtesy that seemed almost out of character for a man known for cruelty. The music began again, softer this time, a waltz that curled through the room like smoke. Eleanor placed her hand in the Duke's, startled by how warm his grip was despite the coldness of his expression. He guided her into the first steps with practiced ease, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the rustle of silk and the murmur of the watching crowd. "You are angry with me," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I am angry on behalf of a woman who does not deserve to be humiliated in front of strangers," Eleanor said. "Whether or not I am angry with you specifically depends on whether you intend to apologize to her." "I do not apologize," he said simply, as though the concept itself were foreign to him. "Then perhaps the rumors are true after all." His steps did not falter, but something tightened in his jaw. "You are very quick to judge a man you met 5 minutes ago." "You gave me little else to judge you by," Eleanor said. "A man is known by his actions, Your Grace, not by his title." They turned together, and for the briefest moment, his hand tightened at her waist, guiding her through a turn with a precision that made her breath catch despite herself. She hated that she noticed it, hated that some traitorous part of her found the closeness unsettling in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "You dance well, for someone who claims to despise me," he observed. "I dance well because my mother insisted upon lessons," Eleanor said. "It has nothing to do with my opinion of my partner." "And what is your opinion of your partner, now that you have had a few moments to observe him up close, rather than from across a ballroom?" Eleanor considered lying, considered offering some polite, meaningless answer that would end this uncomfortable conversation, and let her retreat to the safety of the wall where she belonged. But something in his eyes, a flicker of genuine curiosity beneath all that ice, made her answer honestly instead. "I think you are a man who has convinced himself that cruelty is safer than kindness," she said. "I do not know why. I do not particularly wish to know why. But I do not think you are as cold as you would like everyone to believe." For the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Voss looked genuinely startled, as though she had struck him somewhere he had not expected to be vulnerable. The music swelled around them, drawing toward its final measures, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes still fixed upon the pair of them, whispering, wondering, waiting. As the last notes faded, the Duke did not release her hand immediately. He held it a moment longer than propriety allowed, his gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she could not name. "One waltz with me, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "and you will be my wife." The words landed in the sudden silence of the ballroom, like a stone dropped into still water. For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought she had misheard him. Surely a man did not propose marriage to a woman he had just met, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, after a single dance conducted in near silence and simmering disagreement. Surely this was some cruel jest, another performance meant to humiliate, the way he had humiliated the girl before her. But his eyes held no laughter. They held something far more unsettling, something that looked almost like certainty. A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd, followed by a wave of frantic whispering. Somewhere behind her, Eleanor heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, torn between horror and disbelief. Lady Constance's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, the sound swallowed by the rising murmur of 300 stunned guests. Eleanor stared up at the Duke of Voss, her heart pounding so violently she was certain he could feel it through her gloved hand still resting in his. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I am entirely serious," he said. "I do not jest, Miss Whitmore. Ask anyone in this room. I have never once said something I did not mean to see through." Around them, the ballroom had erupted into a storm of whispers, but Eleanor heard none of it clearly. All she could hear was the echo of his words, and the terrible, thrilling uncertainty of not knowing whether she had just witnessed the beginning of a nightmare, or something far more dangerous entirely. By morning, all of London knew what had happened at the ball. Eleanor had barely finished her tea before 3 separate notes arrived at the Whitmore house, each one demanding details, each one written in the eager, hungry hand of a woman desperate for gossip. Her mother read every line aloud at the breakfast table, her voice trembling somewhere between horror and triumph. "He cannot have meant it," Eleanor said for perhaps the 10th time since waking. "It was a jest, or a test of some kind, or a fit of temper. Dukes do not propose marriage to strangers in the middle of a ballroom. This one apparently does," her mother said, setting down the 3rd letter with visibly shaking hands. "Eleanor, do you understand what this means? If the Duke of Voss truly intends to marry you, our family's fortunes change entirely. You would want for nothing, none of us would. I do not wish to marry a man simply because he announced it in front of witnesses," Eleanor said. "I do not even know him. What I do know of him is troubling. I watched him humiliate a young woman without a flicker of remorse. Is that the sort of husband you wish for me, Mother?" Margaret's face softened, though the desperation in her eyes did not fade entirely. "I wish for you to be safe and provided for, and not left to the mercy of whatever modest future your father's estate can offer once it passes to your cousin. I know it is not romantic, Eleanor, but you are 23, and opportunities like this do not knock twice." Eleanor said nothing, staring down at her cooling tea. She understood her mother's fear better than she let on. Their family's circumstances had never been comfortable, and after her father's death 2 years earlier, the modest income that remained had grown thinner each season. She had watched her mother count coins late at night, watched the careful mending of gowns that should have been replaced years ago. Marriage to a duke, however unsettling the man himself might be, would end all of that in a single stroke. But Eleanor had never been the sort of woman who could trade her own happiness for security without a fight. The summons arrived that afternoon, delivered by a footman in the Voss livery, requesting Eleanor's presence at the Voss townhouse the following day to discuss what the letter called, with careful formality, a matter of mutual understanding. Eleanor read it 3 times before folding it and setting it aside, her hands not quite steady. She arrived the next afternoon dressed in her plainest gown, a small act of quiet rebellion against a world suddenly determined to dress her in silk she had not chosen. The Voss townhouse was enormous, all marble floors and towering windows, and Eleanor felt smaller with every step the butler led her through its halls. The Duke was waiting for her in a study lined with books, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the garden as though the answer to some private question might be found among the hedges. He turned when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You came," he said finally. "I was summoned," Eleanor replied. "I did not think refusing a duke would be wise, given how quickly rumors travel in this city." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "No, I imagine not. Your Grace, I must ask you plainly. Did you mean what you said at the ball, or was it some manner of performance, a way to embarrass me the way you embarrassed that other young woman?" His expression sharpened at the mention of the girl, something flickering behind his eyes that Eleanor could not quite read. "I meant every word. I do not say things I do not intend to honor, Miss Whitmore. Whatever else you believe of me, believe that." "Then you must explain yourself," Eleanor said, "because I confess I do not understand. You do not know me. We spoke for the length of a single waltz, most of which consisted of you defending cruelty and me condemning it. What manner of foundation is that for a marriage?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. "Perhaps none at all," he admitted. "Perhaps it is foolish, but I have spent years watching women maneuver themselves into my path, flattering me, agreeing with everything I say, pretending admiration they do not feel, all in pursuit of a title and a fortune. You did none of that. You looked at me and told me exactly what you thought, without fear, without flattery. I found that I could not stop thinking of it." Eleanor's chest tightened at the unexpected honesty in his voice, so different from the icy performance she had witnessed at the ball. "That is not the same as affection, Your Grace. Admiring my honesty does not mean you know my character, nor I yours." "Then let us become acquainted," he said. "I am not asking you to walk to the altar tomorrow, Miss Whitmore, whatever the gossips may say. I am asking for the chance to prove that I am not entirely the man you believe me to be. If, after a proper courtship, you find you cannot bear the thought of marrying me, I will release you from any expectation, publicly if necessary, and bear whatever embarrassment results." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his face for some sign of deception, some hint that this was merely another game. She found none, only a strange, guarded sincerity that unsettled her more than his cruelty had. "And the young woman from the ball," she said. "Will you apologize to her?" Something like discomfort crossed his features, quickly masked. "Her family sought an alliance through her, pushing her toward me at every opportunity. whether or not she wished it herself. I grew tired of being pursued as though I were a prize to be won rather than a man to be known. My words to her were unkind. I will not pretend otherwise, but I did not humiliate her without reason, whatever the room believed they witnessed. That is not an apology, Eleanor said. No, he agreed. It is an explanation. I am not accustomed to apologizing, Miss Whitmore. It is not a skill I have had much occasion to practice. Despite herself, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth twitch, some traitorous amusement breaking through her wariness. Then perhaps that should be your first lesson, if you truly intend to court me properly. A man who cannot apologize will make a very difficult husband. Then teach me, he said, and there was something almost boyish in the way he said it, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. Over the following days, against every instinct that told her to keep her distance, Eleanor found herself accepting the Duke's invitations, first to a quiet walk through Hyde Park, chaperoned by her mother at a discreet distance, and later to a small gathering at his estate outside the city, where he showed her the library that had belonged to his mother, his voice softening in a way she had not thought him capable of. She learned that his coldness had not always been part of him. He spoke, sparingly and with visible reluctance, of an earlier engagement, years before, to a woman who had promised her heart, and then abandoned him for a wealthier match the moment a better offer appeared. He did not dwell on it, did not seek her pity, but Eleanor began to understand the shape of the wound beneath his ice, the way a man might build walls around himself after learning that warmth could be weaponized against him. You do not have to trust me with all of it, she told him one evening, as they walked along the edge of his garden while the sun sank low behind the trees. But if you wish for a real marriage, Your Grace, rather than an arrangement built on convenience, you will have to let someone see you as you actually are, not merely the reputation you have built to protect yourself. He looked at her for a long moment, the evening light softening the sharp lines of his face. You are the first person in a very long time who has asked to see that, rather than simply asking what I could give them. Perhaps that is because most people are afraid of you, Eleanor said. I confess I was, at first. And now? She considered the question honestly before answering. Now I think you are lonelier than you are cruel. I do not know yet whether that is enough for me to trust you completely, but it is enough to make me wish to understand you further. Word of their courtship spread quickly through London society, each outing observed, dissected, and repeated with growing exaggeration in every drawing room in the city. Lady Constance Hale watched the growing attachment between them with mounting fury, certain that the position she had spent years maneuvering to claim was slipping through her fingers, stolen by a woman with neither fortune nor breeding sufficient to deserve it. She began, quietly at first, to lay the groundwork for Eleanor's downfall, certain that a woman so plainly unsuited for the role of Duchess would eventually give her the opening she needed. She did not yet know what form that opening would take. But she was patient, and she was determined, and she had never once in her life failed to get what she wanted. Eleanor, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her, allowed herself, for the first time since her father's death, to imagine a future that did not consist entirely of counted coins and mended gowns. She did not yet love the Duke of Voss, but she no longer believed him to be the monster London had painted him to be, and that realization frightened her nearly as much as it comforted her. One afternoon, her mother found her sitting at the window of their small parlor, a book open and forgotten in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. Margaret settled into the chair across from her, folding her hands with the careful patience of a woman who had learned, over many years, exactly when to press her daughter and when to wait. You are thinking of him again, Margaret said, not quite a question. I am thinking of a great many things, Eleanor admitted. Whether I am foolish to trust a man London calls cruel, whether my judgment can be relied upon when so much depends upon the answer, whether I am simply desperate to believe the best of him, because the alternative is too disappointing to bear. And what does your heart tell you, when you set aside all the reasoning? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. My heart tells me that when he speaks of his mother's library, his voice changes entirely, that when he thinks no one is watching, the coldness slips from his face like a mask he has simply forgotten to hold in place. My heart tells me that a man who has been wounded so deeply that he built an entire reputation around never being wounded again is not the same as a man who enjoys causing pain for its own sake. That sounds like the beginning of affection, Margaret said gently. It sounds like the beginning of foolishness, perhaps, Eleanor said, though there was no real conviction in the words. I have known him a fortnight, Mother. It is not enough time to build a marriage upon. No, Margaret agreed. But it may be enough time to begin one. if you are willing to let it continue honestly, rather than deciding its ending before it has properly started. Eleanor said nothing more on the matter that day, but her mother's words followed her long after the conversation had ended, settling into the quiet corners of her mind where doubt and hope wrestled for space. The following week, the Duke invited her to a small dinner at his estate, a gathering far more modest than the grand ball where their strange courtship had begun. Only a handful of guests attended, distant relations and old family friends, none of whom regarded Eleanor with the open hostility she had braced herself to encounter. If anything, they seemed curious about her, watching with quiet interest as the Duke pulled out her chair himself rather than allowing a servant to do it, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed by the sharp-eyed company. After dinner, as the other guests retired to the drawing room for cards, the Duke drew Eleanor aside into a quiet corridor lined with portraits of his ancestors, stern faces staring down from gilded frames. "My mother," he said, gesturing to a portrait near the end of the hall, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle mouth, so unlike the cold formality of the other Voss ancestors surrounding her. "She died when I was 12. My father remarried within the year, a woman more concerned with her own comfort than with raising another woman's son. I do not say this for your pity, Miss Whitmore. I say it because I think you deserve to understand why I find warmth so difficult to offer freely. It was taken from me quite early, and rarely offered again without some manner of cost attached." Eleanor studied the portrait, then turned to study him instead, searching his face for the boy who had lost his mother too young and never quite recovered the ability to trust affection when it was given. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I do not think less of you for it. If anything, I think I understand you a little better now. That is more than most people bother to attempt," he said. "Then most people are not looking closely enough," Eleanor replied. He turned to face her fully then, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen before, not even in their most honest conversations in the garden. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time since they had met, "I know I gave you little choice in how this began. A declaration shouted across a ballroom is no proper way to begin a courtship, and I am aware of how it must have felt to you, to have your future decided in a single reckless moment. I do not regret the words, but I do regret that I did not ask you first whether you wished for them at all." "You are apologizing," Eleanor said, a small, surprised smile touching her lips. "I believe that is progress, Your Grace." "Alistair," he corrected softly, "if we are to continue this properly, I would prefer you use my name, at least when we are alone." "Alistair," Eleanor repeated, testing the shape of it, finding that she did not dislike the sound of it at all. They stood together in the quiet corridor a moment longer, the murmur of cards and conversation drifting faintly from the drawing room beyond, and for the first time since the night of the ball, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine that whatever this strange, unconventional courtship had begun as, it might yet become something real, something worth the risk she was taking with her heart. The announcement came on a Sunday, 3 weeks after the ball, delivered not through whispered gossip but through a formal notice published in the London papers, confirming what half the city had already suspected. Duke Alistair Voss intended to marry Miss Eleanor Whitmore, and the wedding would take place before the end of the season. Eleanor read the notice at her own breakfast table, her hands trembling slightly as she held the paper, watching her name printed alongside his in ink that suddenly made the entire strange arrangement feel permanent, in a way that whispered courtship had not. "It is real now," her mother said softly, watching her daughter's face for some sign of the answer she was too afraid to ask for directly. "It has been real for weeks, Mother," Eleanor said. "This is simply the moment the rest of the world is permitted to know it." But even as she said the words, she understood the weight behind them. A private courtship, however unusual its beginning, had been a fragile thing, something that could still be unwound quietly if either of them changed their mind. A public announcement in the London papers was something else entirely. It was a door closing behind her, and Eleanor was not entirely certain she was ready for the sound of it. The days that followed brought a flood of invitations, each one more elaborate than the last, as hostesses across London scrambled to secure the presence of the woman who had somehow captured the notoriously unattainable Duke of Voss. Eleanor found herself thrust into a whirlwind of teas and luncheons and evening gatherings, each one an opportunity for London's finest ladies to study her, assess her, and quietly determine whether she deserved the position she had so unexpectedly claimed. Most were polite, if distant. Some were openly curious, asking pointed questions about how the courtship had begun, clearly hoping for some romantic tale they could repeat over their own tea tables. But a few, Eleanor noticed, watched her with something closer to open resentment, their smiles too tight, their compliments carrying the faint edge of an insult carefully disguised. Lady Constance Hale was, by far, the sharpest of these. They met properly for the first time at a garden party hosted by one of Constance's closest friends, an event Eleanor suspected had been arranged specifically for this confrontation, though she could not have said why she felt so certain of it until Constance approached her directly, her smile bright and entirely without warmth. "Miss Whitmore," Constance said, extending a gloved hand with practiced grace. "How fortunate we finally have the chance to speak. I have heard so very much about you." "I imagine you have heard a great deal that is not entirely accurate," Eleanor replied evenly, accepting the greeting with equal composure, though something in Constance's tone set her instincts on edge. "Perhaps," Constance said, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's gown with a quick, assessing glance that made her feel suddenly underdressed despite the careful attention she had paid to her appearance that morning. "London does love its stories, does it not? A duke, sworn never to marry, suddenly declaring himself to a woman he met only weeks ago. It is quite romantic, I suppose, if one does not think too carefully about how unlikely it seems." "I am not certain what you mean to imply, Lady Constance." "Nothing at all," Constance said, her smile widening slightly. "Only that men like the Duke do not change so quickly, so completely, without reason. I have known Alistair for years, Miss Whitmore, long before you arrived to capture his attention. I confess I find myself curious what exactly you offered him, to earn such a swift and public declaration." The insinuation was clear enough, wrapped in polite phrasing but sharp beneath it, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed. "I offered him honesty," Eleanor said. "Perhaps that is simply a rarer commodity than you realize, among the women who have spent years pursuing him for reasons that had nothing to do with honesty at all." Something flickered across Constance's face, quickly smoothed away, but Eleanor had seen it clearly enough, a flash of genuine anger beneath the composed mask. "How very confident you are, for a woman whose family's fortune could not fund a single season at Almack's without careful economy. I do hope, for your sake, that your confidence is not misplaced. Marriages built on such swift, thoughtless foundations rarely survive the first true test." "Is that a warning, Lady Constance, or a wish?" Constance's smile did not waver, but her eyes had gone cold. "Considerate advice, Miss Whitmore, offered freely, from one lady to another. London has a long memory for scandal, and an even longer one for those who reach above their station and fail to hold their footing." She departed without waiting for a response, leaving Eleanor standing amid the garden party's cheerful chatter, with her heart pounding and her composure badly shaken. She understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever peace she had found with Alistair over the past weeks, Lady Constance intended to see it destroyed, and that the woman possessed both the patience and the cunning to make good on that intention. That evening, Eleanor recounted the conversation to Alistair as they walked together through his mother's rose garden, the summer air heavy with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant sound of a fountain. "Constance has always resented not getting her way," Alistair said, his jaw tight with barely restrained irritation. "I am sorry she directed that resentment at you. She has no cause to threaten you, and I will speak to her directly if she persists." "I do not think a warning from you will stop her," Eleanor said. "If anything, I suspect it would only sharpen her determination. She does not strike me as a woman who abandons a plan simply because someone asks her politely to reconsider." "Then what would you have me do?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "Nothing. For now. I do not wish to hide from her, Alistair, nor do I wish for you to fight my battles as though I cannot manage them myself. But I would ask that you tell me honestly, if there is anything in your history with her that I ought to know. I would rather hear it from you than have it delivered to me later, twisted into something far worse than the truth." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening garden ahead of them. "There is little to tell. Constance made her interest known to me some years ago, before my engagement ended so badly. I never returned that interest, and after everything that followed, I had little patience left for courtship of any kind, hers included. She has continued to position herself in my path ever since, certain that persistence alone would eventually win my regard. It never has, and it never will. But I suspect that certainty is precisely what makes your presence in my life so difficult for her to accept." "Then she sees me as an obstacle to something she believes she is owed," Eleanor said. "Yes," Alistair admitted, "and I do not think she will give up that belief easily." Eleanor drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the unease settling in her chest. "Then I suppose I shall have to be prepared for whatever she attempts next." "You will not face it alone," Alistair said, stopping to face her fully. his expression serious in a way that made her chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to affection. "Whatever comes, Eleanor, I intend to stand beside you through it. I have made my choice, and I do not intend to be moved from it, regardless of what Constance or anyone else attempts." "Even if it costs you standing in society?" Eleanor asked. "Even if she succeeds in turning people against me?" "Especially then," he said. "I have spent years allowing my reputation to be shaped by other people's expectations, building walls to keep everyone at a safe distance because it was easier than risking disappointment again. You are the first person who has made me want something different, Eleanor. I will not allow Constance Hale, or anyone else, to take that from me simply because it frightens her to see me finally happy." The word hung between them, unexpected and startling in its simplicity. Happy. Eleanor had not thought to describe the strange, complicated tangle of feelings she carried for him in such plain terms, but hearing him say it aloud, she found she could not entirely disagree. "I am glad," she said softly, "that this arrangement has brought you some measure of happiness. I confess I did not expect to find the same when it began." "And now?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully, watching the last light of evening fade behind the garden's tall hedges. "Now I find that I look forward to your company more than I anticipated, that I trust your honesty, even when it is difficult to hear. That whatever this began as, I no longer regret accepting your hand for that first waltz, however reckless the invitation that followed it." Alistair reached for her hand then, lifting it gently to his lips in a gesture far softer than the cold, calculated man London believed him to be. "Then let Constance do her worst," he said. "I do not intend to let her, or anyone else, convince either of us that what we have found together is not worth defending." But even as Eleanor allowed herself to be reassured by his words, a small, persistent unease lingered at the edges of her thoughts. Lady Constance Hale had not struck her as a woman who issued idle threats, and Eleanor suspected that whatever plan had already begun forming behind that polished, poisonous smile would prove far more dangerous than either of them anticipated. She was right to worry. Within days, the first quiet rumors began to circulate through London's drawing rooms, carried on whispers too vague to trace back to any single source, suggesting that Eleanor Whitmore's family had once faced financial ruin so severe that only a hasty, calculated pursuit of the Duke's fortune could explain the swiftness of their engagement. The rumors were not entirely false, close enough to the truth to be believable, twisted just enough to make Eleanor's honest affection appear instead like careful mercenary ambition. Eleanor first heard the whispers at a musical evening hosted by one of Alistair's distant cousins, catching fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly whenever she drew near, followed by pointed, assessing glances from women who had smiled warmly at her only days before. She said nothing, kept her composure carefully in place, but the weight of it settled heavily in her chest as the evening wore on, a slow, creeping dread that Lady Constance's promised campaign had already begun in earnest, and that far worse was almost certainly still to come. On the carriage ride home, her mother sat across from her, unusually silent, watching Eleanor's face with the careful attentiveness of a woman who had noticed far more of the evening's undercurrents than she cared to admit aloud. "You heard it too," Eleanor said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "I heard enough," Margaret admitted. "Foolish talk about our finances, dressed up as concern for the Duke's welfare. It will pass, Eleanor. These things always do, once some fresh scandal arrives to occupy their attention instead." "Will it pass before the wedding, though?" Eleanor asked. "Or will it simply grow louder, until every guest who attends is whispering behind their fans about whether I married Alistair for love or for his fortune?" Margaret reached across the carriage and took her daughter's hand firmly in her own. "Let them whisper. You know the truth of your own heart, and so does he. That is worth far more than the good opinion of women who have nothing better to occupy their time than tearing down anyone bold enough to rise above where they believe she belongs." Eleanor wanted to believe her mother's confidence, wanted to let the reassurance settle the unease twisting in her stomach, but she had seen the calculated gleam in Lady Constance's eyes at the garden party, and she understood, with a certainty that unsettled her deeply, that idle drawing-room gossip was merely the opening move in a far longer game. She was not wrong to sense it. 2 days later, while calling on a family friend she had known since childhood, Eleanor found herself seated beside a young woman named Charlotte Bray, a cheerful, well-meaning acquaintance who had always spoken to her honestly, even when honesty proved uncomfortable. "I do not know if I ought to tell you this," Charlotte said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard, "but I think you would want to know, rather than be surprised by it later. Lady Constance has been asking questions. Not idle gossip questions, Eleanor. Real questions. About your father's debts before he died. about whether your family sought a match with the Duke deliberately, before the ball, rather than the whole affair being as spontaneous as everyone believes. Eleanor's stomach turned cold. There was no arrangement, Charlotte. I did not even know his name before that night. I believe you, Charlotte said quickly, but Constance is not simply asking to satisfy her own curiosity. She is gathering something, Eleanor, building toward some purpose. I do not know what, but I have known her long enough to recognize the pattern. She does not waste effort on questions, unless she intends to use the answers. The warning settled over Eleanor like a physical weight as she made her way home that afternoon, turning the pieces over in her mind, trying to imagine what Lady Constance might construct from the ordinary, unremarkable details of her family's modest circumstances. There was nothing scandalous in their history, nothing that could not withstand honest scrutiny. But Eleanor had learned enough of Constance's character in their single brief meeting to understand that honesty was rarely the point of such campaigns. The point was doubt, planted carefully, allowed to grow until it choked out whatever trust had been built before it. She resolved to say nothing to Alistair that evening, not wanting to burden him with fears that might yet prove nothing more than idle gossip. But as she sat alone in her room that night, staring at her own reflection in the dim candlelight, Eleanor could not entirely shake the feeling that whatever Lady Constance was building, it would not remain hidden for long, and that when it finally emerged into the light, it would arrive with enough force to test everything she and Alistair had so carefully begun to build between them. The following week brought the first fitting for her wedding gown, a task Eleanor had expected to approach with excitement but found herself facing instead with a strange, hollow apprehension she could not quite name. The seamstress, a brisk, efficient woman named Hannah Fields, pinned yards of pale silk around her with practiced hands, chattering pleasantly about the upcoming ceremony, entirely unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the shop's cheerful walls. "You will make a beautiful bride, Miss Whitmore," Hannah said, stepping back to study her work. "The whole city is speaking of little else, a duke who swore never to marry, brought to his knees by love at first sight. It is the sort of story people will still be telling their grandchildren." "I did not bring him to his knees," Eleanor said, managing a faint smile despite the tightness in her chest. "I simply told him the truth, and he happened to find that novel." "Sometimes that is all it takes," Hannah said warmly, returning to her pins. Alistair arrived unexpectedly toward the end of the fitting, having finished his business early, and come to collect her for the drive home. He waited outside the changing screen with visible patience, and when Eleanor finally emerged in her day dress, gown carefully wrapped for delivery, she found him studying her with an expression that made her pulse quicken despite the unease still lingering from Charlotte's warning. "You look troubled," he observed, once they were settled in his carriage and moving through the crowded streets. "More troubled than a wedding gown fitting ought to produce, even accounting for how tedious I imagine the pinning must be." Eleanor hesitated, torn between her earlier resolution to keep her worries to herself and the growing recognition that hiding them from him now might only make matters worse later, when the truth inevitably surfaced. She chose honesty. "Lady Constance has been asking questions about my family," she admitted. "About my father's finances before he died. Charlotte Bray warned me that Constance seemed to be building toward something, though she did not know what." Alistair's expression darkened, the easy warmth he had shown moments earlier, replaced by something colder, more guarded. "There is nothing shameful in your family's circumstances, Eleanor. Whatever she constructs from ordinary financial difficulty, it will not withstand honest examination." "I know that," Eleanor said, "but Constance does not deal in honest examination, Alistair. She deals in appearances, in doubt, in the kind of story that sounds convincing enough to spread before anyone thinks to question it closely. I do not know what she intends, but I do not think we should assume it will be so easily dismissed." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the passing streets with an unreadable expression. "Then we will face it together, whatever it proves to be. I would rather know the shape of the threat now than be caught unprepared by it later." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his steadiness even as the unease continued to coil tightly in her chest. She did not yet know what Lady Constance was preparing, but some quiet, instinctive part of her understood that whatever it was, it would arrive soon, and that when it did, it would demand more of both of them than either had yet been asked to give. Captain Henry Ashford returned to London on a grey afternoon, 3 weeks before Eleanor's wedding was set to take place, arriving without warning at the Whitmore household, with a bouquet of white roses, and a smile that had once, years ago, made Eleanor's heart flutter in ways she had long since told herself she had outgrown. "Henry," she said, standing frozen in the doorway of her own parlor, startled by how unchanged he looked, how easily his presence pulled her backward, through years she had thought safely buried. I did not know you had returned from your posting. Only this week, he said, stepping forward with the easy confidence that had always come naturally to him. I heard the news of your engagement before I had even unpacked my trunk. Congratulations seemed the proper thing to offer, though I confess it was difficult to write the word without feeling something rather more complicated than simple happiness for you. Eleanor's mother, hovering nearby with poorly concealed curiosity, made a quiet excuse and withdrew, leaving the two of them alone in the parlor with years of unspoken history hanging heavily between them. You should not have come, Eleanor said, though she made no move to ask him to leave. Perhaps not, Henry admitted, settling into the chair across from her without waiting to be invited. But I could not simply let you marry without saying what I should have said years ago, before I left for my commission and left things unfinished between us. I was a fool, Eleanor. I let ambition and duty carry me away from the one thing that might have actually made me happy. Eleanor's chest tightened uncomfortably. She remembered the young man who had courted her gently before his military posting had called him away, remembered the quiet ache of watching him leave without any promise between them, remembered, too, the slow, painful work of convincing her own heart to move forward without him. That was years ago, Henry, she said carefully. I have built a different life since then. I am engaged to be married. To a man London calls the cruelest duke in England, Henry said, his tone shifting subtly, gentle concern layered over something Eleanor could not quite identify. I have heard the stories, Eleanor. Everyone has. I only wonder whether you truly know what you are walking into, or whether the security of his title has made it easier to overlook the warnings. You know nothing of him, Eleanor said, bristling despite herself. The stories exaggerate. He is not the man London believes him to be. Perhaps, Henry said, though his expression suggested genuine doubt rather than agreement. I only ask that you be careful, Eleanor. I would rather see you happy with someone else entirely than see you trapped in a marriage that brings you nothing but regret. Eleanor asked him to leave shortly after, unsettled by the conversation in ways she could not entirely explain to herself. She told herself that his concern was misplaced, that years of separation had left him with an outdated understanding of both her circumstances and her heart. But some small, traitorous corner of her mind lingered on his words long after he had gone, turning them over with an unease she resented feeling at all. He returned twice more over the following week, each visit brief and carefully proper, each conversation circling gently back to doubts about Alistair's character, questions phrased with such gentle concern that Eleanor found herself unable to dismiss them entirely, however much she wished to. She did not tell Alistair of the visits. She told herself it was because there was nothing improper in them, nothing worth troubling him over. But privately, she suspected the truer reason was that she did not entirely trust her own feelings regarding Henry's sudden return, and she was not yet ready to examine that uncertainty too closely. It was during this same unsettled week that Lady Constance made her move. The letter arrived at the Voss townhouse on a Tuesday morning, delivered anonymously, addressed directly to Alistair, in handwriting carefully disguised to avoid identification. Eleanor learned of its existence only when he summoned her that same afternoon, his expression colder than she had seen it since the earliest days of their acquaintance, the warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks entirely absent from his eyes. "Explain this," he said, holding out a folded letter without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Eleanor took the letter with trembling hands and read words that made her blood run cold. It was written as though penned by her own hand, a forged confession, claiming that her engagement to Alistair had been calculated from the very beginning, that her family's desperate financial circumstances had driven her to deliberately position herself in his path at the ball, and that her supposed affection for him was nothing more than careful performance designed to secure his fortune before he could discover the truth of her mercenary intentions. "I did not write this," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Alistair, I swear to you, I have never written a single word of this. I do not even recognize the hand, though I understand why it might resemble my own at a careless glance." "It arrived with details only someone close to you could possibly know," Alistair said, his jaw tight. "Details about your father's debts, about conversations that occurred before we ever met. Lady Constance has been asking questions about my family for weeks," Eleanor said desperately. "Charlotte Bray warned me of it. I should have told you sooner, I see that now. But I did not want to trouble you with suspicions I could not yet prove. This is her doing, Alistair. I am certain of it. You had this information and said nothing?" His voice had gone dangerously quiet, a coldness settling over his features that reminded her, painfully, of the man she had first encountered at the ball, the one capable of destroying a woman with only a few carefully chosen words. You allowed me to hear rumors of your family's ambitions from strangers, rather than trusting me with the truth yourself? I was trying to protect what we had built, Eleanor said, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. I did not want you to doubt me over something that might have amounted to nothing more than idle gossip. I see now that was a mistake, but it was not deception, Alistair. I have never once lied to you. His expression did not soften. Years of guarded suspicion, hardened by a previous betrayal that had never fully healed, seemed to rise to the surface all at once, and Eleanor watched with growing despair as the trust they had so carefully built over the past weeks began visibly crumbling before her eyes. I have been betrayed before by a woman I trusted completely, he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened her more than open anger would have. I swore I would never allow myself to be so thoroughly deceived again. Perhaps I was foolish to believe this time would prove different. This time is different, Eleanor said, stepping toward him, desperate to close the distance she felt opening between them. I am not her, Alistair. Whatever happened before, whatever wound it left, I am not the woman who caused it, and I will not be punished for a betrayal I had no part in. But he had already turned away, his back rigid, his voice carrying a finality that struck her like a physical blow. I think it would be best if you returned home, Miss Whitmore. I require time to consider matters clearly, without the added complication of your presence. The shift from her given name back to the formal address landed with devastating precision, and Eleanor felt something crack painfully in her chest as she recognized how completely the walls had returned, how swiftly weeks of careful trust could crumble beneath the weight of a single well-placed lie. She left the townhouse in silence, refusing to let the tears fall until she was safely inside her own carriage, where they came freely at last, hot and bitter, tracing paths down cheeks she pressed uselessly against her gloved hands. She understood, with painful clarity, exactly what Lady Constance had accomplished with a single forged letter. She had not needed to prove anything true. She had only needed to plant doubt in soil already fertile with old wounds, and watch as that doubt did the rest of the destruction on its own. That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor found herself thinking again of Henry's careful warnings, his gentle insistence that perhaps this engagement had always been built on foundations too fragile to survive real testing. She hated how easily his words returned to her now, how they seemed to fit so neatly alongside the devastation of the afternoon, though some stubborn, clear-eyed part of her recognized the danger in that thought even as it formed. She would not give up so easily. Whatever Lady Constance had constructed, however convincingly it had been built, Eleanor knew the truth of her own heart, and she was not prepared to let a forged letter and old, unhealed wounds destroy something she had come to genuinely value. She resolved, sitting alone in the quiet darkness of her room, that she would find a way to prove the letter false, to expose whatever scheme lay beneath it, and to reclaim the trust that Lady Constance had so carefully, cruelly stolen from her in a single devastating afternoon. But even as she made that resolution, a small, frightened voice at the back of her mind wondered whether trust, once broken so completely, could ever truly be rebuilt at all, or whether Alistair's old wounds had simply been waiting all along for a reason to close the door on happiness before it could be fully claimed. The following morning, Henry Ashford called again, arriving with a bouquet of hothouse flowers and an expression of such practiced sympathy that Eleanor, still raw from the previous day's devastation, found herself almost grateful for the comfort he offered, however much her instincts warned her to remain cautious. I heard what happened, Henry said gently, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for permission. London moves quickly with news of this sort. I am sorry, Eleanor, truly. No woman deserves to be treated so coldly over rumors she had no hand in creating. How did you hear so quickly? Eleanor asked, a small, uneasy suspicion stirring beneath her grief. The letter arrived only yesterday afternoon. Servants talk, Henry said easily, waving the question aside, and I confess I have been keeping closer watch on your circumstances than perhaps I ought to admit. I worried something like this might happen, Eleanor. A man with wounds as deep as his does not heal quickly, whatever affection he might have shown you in recent weeks. I did not wish to see you hurt, but I feared it was only a matter of time. Something in his tone struck her as subtly wrong, though she could not immediately identify what troubled her about it. She studied his face carefully, searching for the easy warmth she remembered from years earlier, and found instead something more calculated beneath the practiced sympathy, a watchfulness that made her suddenly, instinctively cautious. You seem almost to have expected this, she said slowly. I simply understand men like the Duke better than you do, perhaps, Henry said, though his eyes flickered briefly away from hers, just long enough for Eleanor to notice the evasion. Men who build walls as high as his rarely tear them down completely for anyone, however genuine their affection might seem in quieter moments. Or perhaps, Eleanor said, her voice growing sharper as suspicion crystallized into something closer to certainty, you are simply pleased to see this engagement falter, regardless of the cause, because it suits your own purposes rather better than my happiness does. Henry's expression shifted, just briefly, a flash of something colder beneath the concerned mask he had worn so carefully throughout the conversation. He recovered quickly, smoothing his features back into practiced sympathy, but the moment had already registered clearly in Eleanor's mind, a small crack in the performance that she would not soon forget. You wound me with such suspicion, Eleanor, he said lightly, though his voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. I came only out of genuine concern for your welfare. Perhaps, Eleanor said, rising from her seat to signal the conversation's end. But I think it would be best if you did not call again, Henry, at least not until I have had time to properly understand my own circumstances, without additional voices adding further doubt to an already difficult situation. He left without further protest, though Eleanor caught, just before he departed, a final glimpse of something calculating in his expression, something that unsettled her far more deeply than his earlier warnings about Alistair's character ever had. She did not yet understand what game Henry Ashford might be playing, whether his sudden reappearance in her life was mere coincidence or something more deliberately timed. But she resolved, standing alone in her parlor once the door had closed behind him, that she would watch him far more carefully going forward, and that whatever comfort his familiar presence had once offered her, she would not allow it to cloud her judgment again so easily. Her mother found her still standing there minutes later, pale and shaken, and gently guided her to sit before pouring a cup of tea neither of them touched. The whole street will know by evening that the engagement has soured, Margaret said quietly. I have already heard 2 different versions of the story from the milliner's girl this morning, neither of them close to the truth. Let them talk, Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. I cannot control what London chooses to believe. I can only control what I know to be true, and what I am willing to fight for. And are you willing to fight for him? Margaret asked carefully, even now, after he turned you away so coldly. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, thinking of the garden, the portrait of his mother, the rare, unguarded warmth she had glimpsed beneath his careful walls. Yes, she said finally. He was wounded once before, badly enough that he built his entire life around never risking it again. I cannot fault him for fearing it has happened once more, however unfair that fear feels directed at me, but I will not simply accept his silence as the end of it. Someone forged that letter, Mother, and I intend to discover who, and prove it beyond any doubt. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. Then I will help you however I am able. You did not raise yourself to be a woman who surrenders easily, and I do not intend to watch you begin now. Eleanor did not wait for time to heal what silence had broken. 2 days after Alistair had sent her away, she returned to the Voss townhouse uninvited, her chin held high despite the tremor she felt beneath her carefully composed exterior, determined to be heard even if he refused, at first, to listen. The butler hesitated at the door, clearly uncertain whether to admit her given the circumstances, but Eleanor held his gaze steadily until he relented, leading her to the same study where she had first learned the truth of Alistair's wounded past. He was standing near the window when she entered, exactly as he had been the very first time she visited, though the warmth that had grown between them over the following weeks was entirely absent now, replaced by a guarded stillness that made her chest ache. I did not summon you, he said, not turning to face her. No, Eleanor agreed, closing the door behind her with quiet determination. I came because you refused to summon me, and I refuse to let a lie stand unanswered simply because it is more comfortable for you to believe it than to confront the possibility that you were wrong. That drew his attention at last. He turned, his expression carefully neutral, though something flickered behind his eyes that gave her the smallest measure of hope. You are certain, then, that I am wrong? I am certain that I did not write that letter, Eleanor said. I am certain that Lady Constance Hale has spent weeks asking careful questions about my family's finances, questions that align precisely with the details included in that forgery. I am certain that a woman who has spent years positioning herself for your affection would have every reason to want our engagement destroyed, and every capability to construct exactly the kind of deception designed to exploit wounds she knew already existed within you. Constance would not risk something so easily traced back to her, Alistair said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. Would she not? Eleanor asked. She did not sign her name to it, Alistair. She disguised her hand carefully enough that you could not immediately identify her involvement. That is not the behavior of a woman confident enough to act openly. It is the behavior of someone who understood precisely how much damage a single anonymous letter could inflict, provided it landed on ground already prepared to receive it. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, clearly wrestling with something deeper than simple doubt about the letter's authorship. Even if you are correct, he said finally, even if Constance constructed every word of it from calculated malice rather than uncovered truth, you kept information from me, Eleanor. You knew she was circling, gathering details, building towards something, and you said nothing until I confronted you with the result of her efforts. You are right to be angry about that, Eleanor admitted, stepping closer despite his guarded posture. I should have told you the moment Charlotte warned me. I convinced myself I was protecting what we had built, when in truth, I was simply afraid of exactly this outcome. Afraid that voicing my suspicions aloud would somehow make them more real, more dangerous. That was a mistake, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it was a mistake born of fear, Alistair, not deception. There is a difference, even if it does not feel like one to you right now. Something in her words seemed to reach him, a slight softening around his eyes, though the wariness did not entirely disappear. You cannot understand what it is to build your entire life around never being deceived again, only to find the same pattern beginning to repeat itself in exactly the moment you allowed yourself to believe it might finally be different. I do understand it, actually, Eleanor said quietly. Perhaps not from the same wound, but I understand what it is to protect yourself so thoroughly that you nearly convince yourself safety matters more than happiness. I have spent years watching my mother count coins by candlelight, learning to expect disappointment before it arrives, so that it never catches me unprepared. I understand fear, Alistair. I simply refuse to let it decide everything for me, the way it seems determined to decide everything for you. He studied her for a long moment, something raw and uncertain crossing his features before he finally spoke again. If you are right, and Constance is behind this, how do you propose we prove it? An anonymous letter offers little evidence beyond suspicion, however reasonable that suspicion might be. I do not yet know, Eleanor admitted, but I intend to find out, with or without your help. Though I would prefer it be with your help, since it is your trust she has managed to poison most effectively. A ghost of something almost like his rare, reluctant smile touched his mouth. Very well. Where would you propose we begin? They began, at Eleanor's suggestion, with Hannah Fields, the seamstress who had fitted her wedding gown, reasoning that Lady Constance would have needed detailed knowledge of Eleanor's habits and appointments to construct a forgery convincing enough to deceive Alistair so thoroughly. It took little persuasion for Hannah to recall, once questioned carefully, that a woman matching Constance's description had visited her shop only days before the letter arrived, ostensibly inquiring about commissioning her own gown, though she had spent an unusual amount of time examining samples of Eleanor's own correspondence, left carelessly on a side table during a fitting when Eleanor had stepped briefly away. I did think it odd, Hannah admitted, wringing her hands nervously, but I did not wish to accuse a lady of quality of anything improper without cause, Your Grace. I hope I have not done wrong in staying silent until now. You have done nothing wrong, Alistair assured her, though his expression had darkened considerably at the confirmation of what Eleanor had suspected all along. But I would ask that you write down everything you remember of that visit, as clearly and completely as you are able. It may prove necessary. Armed with Hannah's account, they next approached Charlotte Bray, who confirmed, with visible reluctance, that Constance had indeed pressed her with specific, pointed questions about Eleanor's family finances in the days immediately preceding the letter's arrival. Questions detailed enough to explain precisely how the forgery had achieved such convincing accuracy. I should have told you sooner, Charlotte said, guilt written plainly across her face. I worried it would seem I was simply spreading gossip of my own, rather than offering genuine warning. You did warn me, Eleanor said gently. I simply did not act quickly enough on that warning. None of this is your fault, Charlotte. The final piece arrived unexpectedly, delivered by Alistair's own household steward, a quiet, observant man who had noted, without initially understanding its significance, that a servant girl employed by Lady Constance's household had delivered a sealed letter to the Voss townhouse on the same morning the forgery had appeared, claiming only that she had been instructed to leave it with the morning post, and offer no further explanation. Confronted gently but firmly by Alistair himself, the young servant, clearly frightened and unwilling to lose her position over loyalty to an employer who had treated her poorly, confirmed that Lady Constance had dictated the letter's contents to her personally, instructing her to copy it in an unfamiliar hand before delivering it discreetly, with strict instructions never to reveal the source of the request. The evidence, once assembled, left little room for doubt. Alistair sat across from Eleanor in his study that evening. The servant's written confession spread on the table between them, alongside Hannah's account and Charlotte's corroborating testimony, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and lingering guilt. "I should have trusted you from the beginning," he said quietly. "Instead, I allowed old wounds to make my decisions for me, and in doing so, I very nearly gave Constance exactly what she wanted." "You were hurt before by someone you trusted completely," Eleanor said. "It is not unreasonable that such a wound would make you cautious, Alistair. I only wish you had trusted me enough to investigate before condemning me so completely." "I know," he said, "and I am sorry for it, more than I know how to properly express. You did not deserve to be turned away simply because I was too afraid to risk being wrong about you a second time." Eleanor reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. "Then let this be the last time fear makes your decisions for you, at least where I am concerned. I cannot promise you a life entirely free of difficulty, Alistair, but I can promise you honesty, always, even when it is uncomfortable to offer, and even when silence would prove easier." He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "That is more than I have any right to ask for, given how badly I failed you these past days." "Perhaps," Eleanor said softly, "but I find I am inclined to offer it anyway." Their reconciliation, however, still left the matter of Lady Constance unresolved, and both of them understood that confronting her directly would require careful handling, given her standing in society, and the very real damage she could still inflict if allowed to continue unchecked. It was Eleanor who suggested the solution, over tea the following morning, her mind turning over the problem with the same sharp clarity that had first caught Alistair's attention at the ball. "She will deny everything if confronted privately," Eleanor said, but she built her scheme on the assumption that no one would ever trace it back to her. "If we present the evidence publicly, in a setting she cannot easily control or dismiss, her only options will be to confess or to compound her deception with further lies in front of witnesses who already suspect the truth. You propose exposing her at a public gathering," Alistair said, something like reluctant admiration crossing his features. "I propose exposing her at the very next event, where she is certain to attempt some further mischief against us," Eleanor said. "Give her enough rope, Alistair, and she will hang herself with it far more effectively than either of us could manage alone." It was during this same tense period, as Eleanor and Alistair worked carefully to assemble their case against Constance, that Henry Ashford's true motives finally revealed themselves. In a conversation Eleanor stumbled upon entirely by accident while visiting Charlotte Bray's family home for tea. She arrived earlier than expected, shown quietly into the garden by a distracted servant, and found herself close enough to an open window to overhear Henry's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone Eleanor could not immediately see. "The engagement is nearly finished," Henry was saying, his tone carrying none of the gentle warmth Eleanor remembered from their courtship years earlier. "Once it collapses entirely, she will need comfort, familiar comfort, from someone she already trusts. My commission left me with considerable debts, and Eleanor's connection to the Duke, however brief, has made her a far more attractive prospect than she once was. If I can secure her affection now, while she is vulnerable, the marriage that follows will solve every difficulty I currently face." Eleanor stood frozen in the garden, her blood running cold at the calculated cruelty of what she had just overheard, understanding with sudden, painful clarity that Henry's return, his careful warnings, his practiced sympathy, had never been born of genuine concern at all. He had simply been waiting, patiently, for an opportunity to exploit her heartbreak for his own financial gain, exactly as coldly calculating in his own way as Lady Constance had proven to be. She left the garden without confronting him directly, her mind racing as she made her way home, understanding now that she faced not one enemy determined to destroy her happiness, but two, each pursuing their own selfish purpose beneath carefully constructed masks of concern and affection. But rather than despair at the discovery, Eleanor found herself steadied by a new, fierce resolve. She would expose them both, together if necessary, and reclaim not only her engagement to Alistair, but her own dignity, stolen so carelessly by two people who had never once considered her feelings worth genuine regard at all. She went directly to Alistair that same afternoon, finding him in his study reviewing the evidence they had gathered against Constance, and recounted what she had overheard in Charlotte's garden with careful, deliberate calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "He has been courting your sympathy while pretending concern for your welfare," Alistair said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger once she had finished. and planning to profit from your heartbreak the moment our engagement collapsed entirely. It seems Lady Constance is not the only person in London willing to build their own advancement on the ruins of someone else's happiness, Eleanor said grimly. I confess I did not expect Henry to prove quite so mercenary, whatever doubts I had begun to feel about his sudden reappearance. Old affection can make people slow to recognize new deception, Alistair said, and something in his tone suggested he understood the particular sting of that experience rather better than he wished to. You are not foolish for having trusted him initially, Eleanor. He counted on exactly that trust to make his scheme possible. Perhaps, Eleanor said, but I do not intend to remain slow to recognize it any longer. If Constance and Henry believe they can dismantle everything we have built through lies and calculated patience, I think it only fitting that we dismantle their schemes just as thoroughly, and in front of exactly the audience they least wish to witness it. Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like fierce admiration mingling with the anger still evident in his expression. You have grown considerably more formidable since the night of that first waltz, Miss Whitmore. I have had considerable practice this past fortnight, Eleanor said dryly. Between one scheme and another, I have scarcely had time to catch my breath. Together, they spent the following days refining their plan, deciding that the Duchess of Ashcombe's upcoming ball, one of the final grand events before Eleanor and Alistair's wedding, would offer the ideal setting for their confrontation. Nearly everyone of consequence in London would attend, including both Lady Constance and, given his recent persistent attentions toward Eleanor, almost certainly Henry Ashford as well. Eleanor spent long hours reviewing the evidence they had assembled with Alistair, memorizing every detail of Hannah's account, Charlotte's testimony, and the servant girl's written confession, determined that when the moment finally arrived, there would be no possibility of denial sturdy enough to withstand the weight of what they had uncovered. You do not have to be the one to confront her directly, Alistair told her gently. The evening before the ball, as they sat together in his mother's garden, the same quiet space where he had first begun to let down his careful guard weeks earlier. I could present the evidence myself, spare you the discomfort of a public scene. No, Eleanor said firmly. She did not merely attempt to deceive you, Alistair. She attempted to destroy me, to paint me as mercenary and dishonest, in front of the very people whose good opinion I would need to build a life here as your wife. I want to be the one who ends it. I want her to understand, clearly and unmistakably, that she failed. He reached for her hand, lifting it gently to his lips. Then I will stand beside you when you do. I know, Eleanor said, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she believed it completely, without the smallest flicker of the doubt that had once made her hesitate before trusting him at all. Whatever storm awaited them at the Ashcombe ball, she understood now that she would not face it alone, and that understanding, more than any evidence they had gathered, gave her the courage she needed to face what was still to come. That night, she told her mother everything, from the servant girl's confession to Henry's cold calculation overheard through Charlotte's window, watching Margaret's expression shift from horror to fierce, protective anger, as the full shape of the deception became clear. I always thought Henry a pleasant young man, Margaret said quietly, shaking her head. I am glad you saw through him before it cost you anything more than a few uncomfortable conversations. I nearly did not, Eleanor admitted. There was a moment, Mother, when his warnings about Alistair almost took root, when grief and doubt made his voice sound like reason rather than manipulation. I do not like how close I came to believing him. But you did not believe him, Margaret said gently, taking her daughter's hands in her own. You questioned, you watched, and you discovered the truth before it could do lasting harm. That is not weakness, Eleanor. That is exactly the sort of clear-eyed courage that will serve you well as a duchess, when far greater difficulties than jealous rivals inevitably arrive at your door. Eleanor managed a tired smile, drawing strength from her mother's steady confidence. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation she had spent days preparing for, and whatever the outcome, she intended to walk into the Ashcombe ballroom with her head held high, ready at last to close this painful chapter and reclaim the happiness that had so nearly been stolen from her. The Duchess of Ashcombe's ballroom glittered with candlelight, silk, and the particular restless energy of a London season nearing its close, and Eleanor felt every eye turn toward her the moment she entered on Alistair's arm, whispers rippling outward through the crowd like water disturbed by a stone. She had expected the attention. She had prepared herself for it over long, careful days, and still her heart pounded fiercely beneath her composed exterior as she scanned the room and found, exactly where she had expected, Lady Constance Hale, holding court near the refreshment table, resplendent in emerald silk, laughing at something with practiced, brittle charm. Henry Ashford arrived shortly after, and Eleanor watched his gaze find her across the room with the same careful, calculated warmth he had shown throughout his recent visits, entirely unaware that his true intentions had already been discovered. "Are you ready?" Alistair asked quietly, his hand steady beneath hers. "I have been ready for days," Eleanor said, and found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that it was entirely true. They waited until the dancing had paused between sets, when the crowd gathered loosely near the center of the room in conversation, before Alistair raised his voice, pitched carefully to carry across the assembled guests without seeming to shout, a skill Eleanor suspected he had perfected over years of commanding attention, without ever needing to raise his temper. "Before the music resumes," he said, "I find I have a matter requiring the attention of this company, given how thoroughly certain rumors regarding my engagement have already spread through every drawing room in London this past fortnight." A ripple of curious silence spread through the ballroom, conversations trailing off as guests turned toward the sound of his voice. Eleanor felt Lady Constance's gaze snap toward them, her earlier easy laughter freezing into something far more guarded. "Several weeks ago," Alistair continued, "I received an anonymous letter, purporting to reveal that Miss Whitmore's affections toward me were calculated rather than genuine, motivated by financial desperation rather than honest regard. I believed it, briefly, to my considerable shame, and allowed old wounds to convince me of a betrayal that never actually occurred." Whispers surged through the crowd, dozens of eyes swinging between Alistair, Eleanor, and, with growing suspicion, Lady Constance, who had gone very still near the refreshment table, her knuckles whitening around the stem of her glass. "I have since discovered," Alistair went on, his voice carrying an edge of controlled fury beneath its calm surface, "that the letter was not written by Miss Whitmore at all, but dictated, word for word, by another lady of this company, who gathered the details necessary to construct a convincing forgery, through careful, deliberate deception of a shopkeeper entrusted with Miss Whitmore's confidence." "This is absurd," Lady Constance said sharply, her composure cracking audibly despite her obvious effort to maintain it. "You cannot possibly suggest, in front of all these witnesses, that I would stoop to something so beneath me. I have a written confession from the servant girl you instructed to copy the letter in a disguised hand," Alistair said, producing the folded document from inside his coat with deliberate calm. "I have testimony from Hannah Fields, who recalls your visit to her shop and your unusual interest in Miss Whitmore's private correspondence. I have corroborating testimony from Miss Charlotte Bray, regarding the pointed questions you asked her about Miss Whitmore's family finances in the days immediately preceding the letter's arrival. Shall I continue, Lady Constance, or would you prefer to spare yourself further public scrutiny by simply admitting what every piece of evidence I hold already confirms beyond reasonable doubt?" The ballroom had gone utterly silent, every guest straining to witness the confrontation unfolding before them, and Eleanor watched Lady Constance's carefully constructed composure finally shatter entirely under the weight of accumulated proof. "You have no right," Constance hissed, though the fury in her voice carried an unmistakable note of panic beneath it. "Everything I did because I loved you, Alistair, long before this woman ever appeared to steal what should have belonged to me. You cannot simply dismiss years of devotion in favor of some penniless nobody who caught your eye for a single evening." "I never once encouraged your affections, Constance," Alistair said, his voice hardening. "Not in all the years you pursued them. Whatever devotion you believed you were owed existed entirely in your own imagination, and it does not excuse the cruelty of what you attempted against a woman who never once wronged you." Constance's gaze swept the ballroom, taking in the shocked faces surrounding her, the dawning realization that whatever standing she had carefully cultivated over years of careful social maneuvering had just crumbled entirely in a single devastating public moment. Without another word, she turned and fled the ballroom, her emerald silk skirts hissing against the marble floor, leaving behind a wake of stunned murmurs and scandalized whispers that would undoubtedly occupy London's drawing rooms for weeks to come. Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash through her, but she was not finished yet. Her gaze found Henry Ashford across the room, watching the unfolding scene with an expression carefully arranged to suggest sympathetic concern, though Eleanor now recognized the calculation hiding beneath it far too clearly to be fooled any longer. "There is one further matter," Eleanor said, stepping forward before Henry could retreat into the crowd, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Captain Ashford has spent recent weeks offering me comfort and warning me against this engagement, presenting himself as a concerned old friend, motivated purely by regard for my welfare." Henry's expression shifted, wariness creeping in beneath his practiced calm. "Eleanor, I do not know what you mean to imply." "I overheard you, Henry," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the now thoroughly attentive crowd. "In Charlotte Bray's garden, discussing your considerable debts and your plan to secure my affection once this engagement collapsed, believing my heartbreak would make me an easy, profitable match for a man in need of funds rather than genuine regard." A fresh wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the ballroom, and Eleanor watched Henry's face drain of color as he understood, too late, that his careful scheme had been discovered entirely. "That is a gross misunderstanding," Henry said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. You merely hope to profit from my heartbreak, the same way Lady Constance hoped to profit from destroying it." Eleanor finished for him, her tone cold and final. "I think, Captain Ashford, that London has heard quite enough from you this evening. I would advise you not to call upon my family again." Henry opened his mouth as though to protest further, then seemed to think better of it, turning instead to retreat through the crowd with as much dignity as he could salvage, though the whispers following him made clear that whatever reputation he had hoped to preserve had suffered considerably in the space of a few devastating minutes. The ballroom remained silent for a long moment after both schemers had departed, the assembled guests processing the sudden, dramatic unraveling of two carefully constructed deceptions in quick succession. Then, slowly, the murmurs began to shift, no longer scandalized whispers of doubt regarding Eleanor's character, but something closer to genuine admiration for the composed, unflinching manner in which she had defended herself against two separate attempts to destroy her happiness. Alistair turned to her then, taking both her hands in his without any regard for the watching crowd, his expression softer than she had ever seen it in public, the careful ducal composure entirely abandoned in favor of something far more honest. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough that the nearest guests could not help but overhear, though he seemed, for once, entirely unconcerned by their attention, not merely for doubting you when Constance's letter arrived, though that failure weighs heavily enough on its own. "I owe you an apology for every year before I met you, spent convincing myself that trust was too dangerous a risk to take again, that coldness was safer than the possibility of being hurt. You proved me wrong, Eleanor, in every possible way, and I do not intend to spend another day taking that lesson for granted." Eleanor felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the bitter sting of the ones she had shed after their earlier estrangement. "You do not owe me an elaborate apology in front of half of London, Alistair. A quiet one, spoken honestly between the two of us, would have served just as well." "Perhaps," he said, a genuine smile finally breaking through the careful composure he had worn for so many years, transforming his features into something Eleanor suspected very few people in this room had ever been fortunate enough to witness. "But I find I no longer wish to hide what I feel for you behind careful walls and cautious silence. London called me the cruelest duke in England for years, Eleanor, and perhaps I earned that reputation honestly enough, but I would rather be known, from this day forward, as the man fortunate enough to have earned your regard, however unlikely that outcome once seemed to either of us." He drew her hand to his lips, pressing a lingering kiss against her knuckles that drew a soft, startled laugh from the watching crowd, followed by scattered, genuine applause that spread quickly through the ballroom as guests who had witnessed the entire dramatic evening found themselves swept up in the unexpected romance of its conclusion. The following weeks passed in a warm, contented blur, the shadow of Lady Constance and Henry Ashford's schemes fading quickly beneath the genuine happiness that had finally been allowed to bloom freely between Eleanor and Alistair. Lady Constance, disgraced thoroughly by the public confrontation, withdrew from London society entirely, retreating to a distant relations estate in the countryside, where the scandal could not follow quite so persistently. Henry Ashford, similarly humiliated, secured a new commission abroad shortly afterward, and Eleanor heard no further word of him beyond occasional distant gossip that held little interest for her now. On the morning of her wedding, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her mother's small parlor, dressed in the pale silk gown Hannah Fields had so carefully constructed, her hands steady now in a way they had not been during that earlier, anxious-fitting weeks before. "You look radiant," Margaret said softly, adjusting a final stray curl with gentle hands. "I confess, when this began, I worried I had pushed you too eagerly toward a match built on nothing sturdier than a single reckless declaration. I am glad to have been wrong." "You were not entirely wrong," Eleanor said, smiling at her mother's reflection in the glass. "It did begin recklessly. But I think perhaps some of the sturdiest things are built that way, tested early and often, until only the truth remains standing." The church was full when she arrived. Familiar faces and curious strangers alike gathered to witness the conclusion of a courtship that had captivated London's attention for weeks. Alistair waited for her at the altar, and when their eyes met across the length of the aisle, Eleanor felt every remaining trace of doubt dissolve entirely, replaced by a certainty so complete it startled her with its simplicity. Their vows were quiet, sincere, spoken without the elaborate performance London had come to expect from grand society weddings, each word chosen carefully to reflect the honest foundation they had fought so hard to build and protect. When Alistair finally lifted her veil to seal their vows with a kiss, the assembled guests erupted into warm, genuine applause, and Eleanor understood, with quiet joy, that whatever cruel reputation had once surrounded the Duke of Voss, it had finally, completely, been laid to rest. The wedding breakfast that followed stretched long into the afternoon, filled with warmth Eleanor had scarcely dared to imagine possible only weeks earlier, when doubt and deception had threatened to unravel everything before it properly began. Charlotte Bray found her during a quiet moment between toasts, embracing her warmly. "I am so very glad it ended this way," Charlotte said. "I worried, when I first warned you of Constance's questions, that I had only added to your troubles, rather than helping to prevent them." "You gave me exactly the warning I needed," Eleanor said, squeezing her friend's hands gratefully. "Whatever came after, I do not think we would have uncovered the truth in time without your honesty. I owe you a debt I do not know how to properly repay." "Invite me to visit often, once you are settled as a duchess," Charlotte said, laughing. "That will more than settle the matter between us." Hannah Fields, too, approached shyly during the celebration, still faintly worried that her earlier hesitation to speak of Constance's suspicious visit might have caused lasting harm. Eleanor reassured her warmly, insisting that her honesty, once given, had proven essential to exposing the truth, and promising her continued patronage for every gown a duchess might require in the busy seasons ahead. Even Eleanor's mother, watching from a nearby table with an expression of quiet, overwhelming pride, seemed scarcely able to believe the transformation her daughter's life had undergone since that first fateful evening at the ball. As the afternoon wore into evening, the musicians struck up a familiar waltz, the same melody that had played the night everything between Eleanor and Alistair had first, so unexpectedly, begun. Alistair extended his hand toward her with a small, knowing smile, and Eleanor took it without hesitation, allowing him to lead her once more onto the dance floor, this time surrounded not by scandalized whispers and uncertain speculation, but by genuine warmth and celebration. "Do you remember what you told me, the very first time we danced together?" he asked quietly, guiding her through the familiar steps with practiced ease. "I told you that I danced well only when the partner was worth the trouble," Eleanor said, smiling up at him. "I believe I have since revised that opinion rather significantly." "Have you?" he said, feigning surprise. "And what is your opinion of your partner now, having had considerably more than a single waltz to observe him?" Eleanor considered the question with mock seriousness, drawing out the moment just long enough to make him wait for her answer, before finally allowing her expression to soften into something entirely genuine. "I think he is a man who nearly let fear cost him the very happiness he most wanted, and who found, in the end, the courage to choose trust instead. I think that courage was worth every difficult moment it took to reach it." "A fair assessment," Alistair said softly, drawing her closer as the music swelled around them. "Though I confess I find myself considerably more fortunate in the outcome than I deserve, given how badly I nearly ruined everything through my own stubborn fear." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but I have found that people who recognize their own mistakes clearly enough to correct them are rather rarer and considerably more worth keeping than those who never make mistakes at all." They danced together as the sun set fully behind the estate's tall windows, the golden light of countless candles casting the ballroom in a warm glow entirely unlike the cold, watchful atmosphere of that first fateful evening months earlier. Eleanor found herself thinking, as the music carried them through turn after familiar turn, that whatever trials had tested them along the way, Lady Constance's cruel deception, Henry Ashford's calculated betrayal, Alistair's own deeply rooted fear of being wounded again, each difficulty had only strengthened the foundation they had built together, until nothing London's gossip or old wounds could offer seemed capable of shaking it any longer. That evening, as they finally stood together in the quiet garden of his estate, now truly their shared home, watching the last light of a long, eventful day fade gently behind the trees, Alistair drew her close, resting his chin against the top of her head with a contentment she suspected few people in London would have believed him capable of feeling. "One waltz," he murmured, echoing the words that had begun everything so unexpectedly weeks earlier. "I did not know, that night, how completely you would change everything I believed about myself." "Nor I," Eleanor admitted, leaning into his warmth, "but I find I would not trade a single difficult moment of it, Not the doubt, nor the fear, nor even Constance and Henry's cruel schemes, if it meant arriving anywhere other than exactly here. They stood together in comfortable silence, as darkness settled fully over the garden, two people who had begun as strangers bound by a reckless declaration, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, built something honest and lasting from it. The cruel Duke London had once feared was gone, replaced by a man finally willing to be known, and the overlooked young woman, who had once stood quietly at the edges of every ballroom, had found, at last, a place fully her own, standing not in anyone's shadow, but beside the man she had chosen freely, and who had, in turn, chosen her with equal, unwavering certainty. Winter arrived early that year, settling over the Voss estate in a soft blanket of frost that turned the garden Eleanor had come to love into something quiet and glittering, entirely different from the warm, blooming space where she and Alistair had first begun to trust each other months earlier. She stood at the window of what was now unmistakably her own study, a small room adjoining the grand library that had once belonged to Alistair's mother, watching the frost creep delicately across the glass, when a knock sounded softly at the door. "A letter has arrived for you, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, offering a sealed envelope with careful hands. "From Miss Charlotte Bray." Eleanor accepted it with genuine pleasure, settling into the window seat to read as the winter light filtered pale and cold through the glass. Charlotte's letters had become a regular, welcome fixture of her new life, filled with cheerful gossip and warm affection that reminded her, pleasantly, of the friendship that had helped carry her through the difficult weeks of her courtship. The letter, however, carried news Eleanor had not anticipated. Charlotte wrote that Lady Constance Hale, having spent the past several months in quiet exile at her relation's country estate, had recently written to several old acquaintances in London, expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse for her actions, and requesting, with unusual humility, whether there might be any path toward eventual forgiveness, however distant that possibility might currently seem. Eleanor set the letter down thoughtfully, considering the news with more complicated feelings than she had expected. She carried Alistair's account of the letter to him that evening, finding him in the library reviewing correspondence from his estate manager, and watched his expression shift through several emotions as she relayed Charlotte's news. "I confess I did not expect genuine remorse from her," he said finally, setting his papers aside. "Calculated apology, perhaps, if she believed it might restore some portion of her damaged standing. But Charlotte's letter suggests something more sincere than that. Perhaps disgrace has taught her something that years of careful maneuvering never could," Eleanor said. "I do not know whether I am prepared to forgive her fully, Alistair. What she attempted against us was cruel and calculated, regardless of whatever regret she claims to feel now. But I find I do not wish to carry that anger indefinitely either. It seems a heavy thing to hold on to, now that we have built something so much better than anything her schemes could have destroyed." "What would you propose, then?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Not friendship. Not yet, perhaps not ever, but I think I could manage civility, if she is genuinely prepared to offer a proper apology, rather than simply seeking to repair her own reputation. I would rather extend that chance and be disappointed than close the door entirely and wonder, always, whether people are capable of genuine change." Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like quiet admiration crossing his features. "You are considerably more generous than I would have managed, given everything she attempted against you." "Perhaps," Eleanor said. "Or perhaps I simply understand, better than I once did, how loneliness and fear can drive people toward choices they later regret bitterly. I do not excuse what she did, but I no longer wish to let her cruelty shape any further part of my life, and holding on to anger indefinitely seems its own kind of prison." They exchanged careful correspondence with Lady Constance over the following weeks, and though the process remained cautious and far from warm, Eleanor found, to her genuine surprise, that Constance's eventual letter of apology carried none of the calculated charm that had once characterized her every public performance. It read instead as the words of a woman who had spent months in quiet reflection, confronting honestly the emptiness of ambitions built entirely on securing a title rather than genuine connection, and finding, in that reckoning, considerably more humility than pride would once have permitted her to show. Eleanor did not invite her back into London society, nor did she pretend the friendship between them could ever be fully restored, but she extended, in her own careful reply, an acknowledgement of the apology's sincerity, and a small measure of grace that she hoped might allow Constance the chance to build something better from the ruins of her earlier ambitions, wherever her path led from here. Henry Ashford's fate proved considerably less redemptive. Word reached them, through the same reliable channels of London gossip that had once threatened to destroy Eleanor's own reputation, that his new commission abroad had ended poorly, his mounting debts and questionable conduct eventually catching up with him in ways his charm could no longer smooth over. Eleanor felt little beyond distant, faintly regretful curiosity at the news, the last remaining traces of old affection finally, completely extinguished by the clarity of what she had learned about his true character. Spring returned to the estate gradually, the frost retreating from the garden windows, the roses Alistair's mother had once tended beginning their slow, patient return to bloom. Eleanor found herself increasingly occupied with the responsibilities of her new position, learning the careful management of a grand household, corresponding with tenants and estate managers, and gradually earning the genuine respect of a staff that had initially regarded their new duchess with cautious uncertainty, given how unconventionally her marriage had begun. She discovered, too, a particular satisfaction in continuing the restoration of the estate's neglected library, a project she had begun almost accidentally during those early, uncertain weeks of courtship, and which had grown, over the following months, into something closer to genuine passion. Alistair often found her there in quiet evening hours, surrounded by carefully catalogued volumes, and would settle beside her with his own correspondence, content simply to share the comfortable silence of two people no longer afraid of what honest closeness might eventually cost them. "You have transformed this place," he told her one such evening, glancing around the library that had once felt cold and formal, now warmed considerably by careful attention and genuine care. "I do not simply mean the shelves, though I confess I scarcely recognize half of what you have accomplished here. I mean the whole of it, Eleanor. This house feels like a home now, in a way it has not since my mother was alive to make it so." "I am glad," Eleanor said softly, setting aside the volume she had been cataloging to take his hand. "I hoped, when I first proposed restoring this room, that it might become something more than simply a task to occupy my time. I did not expect it to matter quite so much to either of us. Everything about you has mattered considerably more than I expected, from the very first evening we met," Alistair said, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "I do not think I have properly thanked you, Eleanor, for refusing to let fear win. That day you returned to this house uninvited and demanded I listen to reason rather than old wounds." "You do not need to thank me," Eleanor said, smiling. "I would have fought for this 100 times over, if it meant arriving here, in this exact moment, with you." Outside, the garden continued its slow, patient bloom, the same roses that had witnessed their earliest, most uncertain conversations, now flourishing beneath careful tending, a quiet testament to how thoroughly patience and honest care could transform even the most neglected, guarded ground into something genuinely alive again. Eleanor thought, watching the evening light settle gently over the library shelves she had so carefully restored, that perhaps this was the truest measure of everything they had built together. Not the dramatic confrontation at the Ashcombe ball, nor even the wedding vows exchanged before half of London's fascinated attention, but these quiet, ordinary evenings, filled with comfortable silence and genuine trust, earned slowly and honestly through every difficult trial that had come before it. That summer, nearly a year after the ball where everything between them had first so unexpectedly begun, Eleanor's mother came to stay at the estate for several weeks, delighting in a comfort and ease she had not known in years. Free at last from the careful counting of coins that had once shadowed every corner of her life. Eleanor watched her mother walk the garden paths with unhurried contentment and felt a quiet, powerful gratitude settle over her, understanding fully now the weight her mother had carried alone for so long after her father's death. "You did this," Margaret told her one afternoon, gesturing to the flourishing garden, the comfortable house, the entire transformed shape of both their lives. "Not simply by marrying well, Eleanor, though I confess that eased burdens I had not admitted even to myself. You did this by refusing to be anyone other than exactly who you were, even when doing so seemed the more difficult, more dangerous path. I am prouder of you than I know how to properly express. I could not have managed any of it without you," Eleanor said, embracing her mother warmly. "You taught me that love without honesty is worth very little, and honesty without courage accomplishes nothing at all. I simply tried to hold both of those lessons close, even when it frightened me to do so." Alistair, too, found himself changed in ways that continued to surprise those who had known him before Eleanor's arrival in his life. His steward remarked quietly and with clear affection that the household had grown considerably warmer since the wedding, the staff no longer bracing themselves against unpredictable cold moods, but working instead within an atmosphere of genuine, settled contentment that had transformed the very rhythm of the estate. He began, that summer, corresponding more regularly with distant relations he had long kept at careful arm's length, extending invitations he would never have considered offering only a year earlier, slowly rebuilding connections that his earlier wounds had convinced him were not worth the risk of maintaining. Eleanor watched this quiet transformation with private, considerable pride, understanding that whatever credit she deserved for helping him find his way toward it, the courage to actually walk that path had always, ultimately, belonged entirely to him. On the anniversary of their first meeting, they held a small gathering at the estate, deliberately modest compared to the grand spectacle of the Ashcombe Ball, filled only with those who had proven themselves genuine friends throughout the difficult months of their courtship. Charlotte Bray attended, along with her new husband, a quiet, kind gentleman she had married that spring. Hannah Fields came as well, having become something considerably closer to a friend than a mere seamstress over the intervening months, her business flourishing considerably under the patronage of London's newest, most talked-about Duchess. As the evening wound down and their guests began departing into the warm summer night, Alistair drew Eleanor aside into the garden once more, the same quiet space that had witnessed so much of their story's most important moments. "A year ago tonight," he said softly, "I stood in a ballroom and made the most reckless declaration of my entire life, certain of nothing, except that I could not simply let you walk away without knowing you further. And now?" Eleanor asked, echoing the question he had once posed to her. "Now I find myself considerably more certain of a great many things," he said, drawing her close. "Certain that recklessness, occasionally, proves wiser than caution. Certain that the right person can teach even the most guarded heart how to trust again. And entirely certain, Eleanor, that whatever years remain ahead of us, I intend to spend every single one of them exactly as grateful as I am tonight, for the woman bold enough to tell a cruel duke exactly what she thought of him, and patient enough to help him become someone worthy of her regard in return." The cruel Duke London had once feared existed now only in old, fading gossip, replaced entirely by a man who had learned, through considerable difficulty, that vulnerability was not the weakness he had once believed it to be, but rather the very foundation upon which genuine happiness could finally be built. And Eleanor, once the overlooked young woman standing quietly at the edges of every ballroom, had found in this transformation not merely a title or a fortune, but something considerably more valuable, a partnership built on honesty, tested thoroughly by every obstacle placed deliberately in its path, and proven, in the end, entirely worth the risk it had taken to claim it.